Our fourth and final man, Dick Caselton, is Banstead born and bred. His parents came from Norfolk. His father was born at sea as well, which is quite rare. You don't see that these days. He was the son of a marine engineer. They settled down in Norwich, though, and Dick's father came to Banstead after a spell in the army. He came to work at the asylum as an attendant, and there he met a nurse, his future wife, Louisa Brown. And they were very soon married here in All Saints. They set up their married home in 30 Diceland Road. Louisa lost her job immediately, as all women did as soon as they became married, in virtually every single role that was open to them. And she became the housewife and homemaker, the future mother to his children. They went on to have 6 children together, and they're all sons, and Dick was the first of those. 30 Diceland Road is a small house. It's not big, and to have 8 people living in that house seems quite extraordinary. It's the house that I was born in, as it were, many years ago. Born in the hospital, obviously, but grew up there and spent my first 3 years. There. Mum and Dad, could you get 8 people in the house? No. It's hard to imagine. And they stayed there for years and years until they were grown-up boys as well. I mean, you can imagine they must have been sleeping down, 2 in the lounge, 2 upstairs in the main bedroom, and goodness knows where they found any place to lay their head. But Dick went to school in Banstead. His dad went away for a little while to fight in the Boer War. He fought with General Frederick Roberts' successful campaign. He was at Paardeberg when they won a famous victory on Majuba Day. And from his father's commander's name, Roberts, and the day, Majuba, Dick's 4th brother, Roberts Majuba Caselton, took his name. It's not the only person to be named after the Boer War. We have a Baden-Powell that was living here in Banstead, and a Kitchener as well, quite a vogue for it at the time. Roberts Majuba is the only Roberts Majuba that has ever been and probably ever will be born. Dick went to school at Banstead, as his brothers did, and after that he became a groom, and very much like Sidney Chandler had done, being a groom turned into being a chauffeur when cars came along. And he was working as a chauffeur when war broke out. One of his younger brothers signed up in the autumn of 1914, and Dick signed up just a couple of weeks after he did. Eventually the whole family was pretty much in the army, even the youngest that could possibly get away with it, Roberts, who joined the army shortly before his 15th birthday, aged just 14, lying about his age, pretending to be his older brother William, who in turn had to lie about his age to join the army, so I don't know what that was all about. Anyway, Dick joined the Royal Fusiliers. So very unusually for a chauffeur, he didn't become a driver in the army, he became just a private in the infantry. He trained on the home front for just a few short months before he went overseas. And he went to Belgium in February of 1915. And there he joined the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. They were a veteran unit, regular army. They'd been in India before the war. They'd come back in the autumn of 1914, briefly refitted in England before heading out to France and Belgium. They had been in the Ypres salient, the bulge in the line around the low-lying Belgian market town of Ypres, for just about 3 weeks by the time he joined them. They'd already lost 300 men to frostbite. The trenches were flooded. The men were standing around in freezing conditions, and these 300 men ended up in hospital, about a third of their fighting strength. They'd also lost 100 men in those 3 weeks just through the attritional warfare in the salient at the time. The British and the Germans and the French had fought the last encounter, Battle of the Race to the Sea, in the autumn of 1914. The lines had crystallised where they had met, and it had not calmed down since. There was local fighting for local advantage going on all the time, an awful lot of sniping in very poor trenches, many of which were actually above ground because you couldn't dig down because the water table was so high, so they'd pile up dirt above ground to use as a breastwork to hide behind. Very poor trenches, not at all safe for the men that were in there, and their casualty rates were extremely high. You would see casualty rates of over 100% over a period of 6 months in the units that were serving there. The original men being killed or wounded, and their replacements subsequently being killed or wounded. It was a terrible time for the men that were serving there. For the very last time, I'll describe the situation at Ypres. For those of you sitting at the back in the market town of Ypres, this would be the road to Menin down the middle here. Over here, we have low-lying ground tapering away towards the coast. It's flat, It's marshland, it's very boggy, it's a very unhealthy place to be. This is where you can't dig a trench and you have to pile up the earth instead. Running in over here in the distance is a ridge about 3 or 4 miles away from the town of Ypres. It's only as high as we are here above Winkworth Road, so it's not a great height, but it's the greatest height in the area in a very flat landscape, so it's very strategically important. Over here we have the village of Passchendaele, which will become infamous in 1917. The thin ridge curves along here, and it starts to curve inwards over here. The high ground of the Gellivelt Plateau, where infamous places like Polygon Wood are. And then over there in the far distance, the high ground of the Messines Ridge, and the two hills, Mount Kemmel and the Scherpenberg in the distance over there. And it's over there, near Kemmel. It was one of the first places that Dick serves in the line. But he's all over the place. In the very short space of time that he's there, he was only in Belgium for 66 days. In that very short space of time, he is all over the salient in all kinds of difficult and dangerous situations, sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a time, sometimes for longer. And in the middle of April of 1915, as the Germans are just getting geared up to launch their gas attack, in the north of the salient, that half of the salient, he's up here on the ridge, the village of Broodsander, which is quite near Passchendaele. So the line curves along the high ground around here, and then it curves around down onto the plain, and then round here to join the canal over there. This is where the Germans are going to launch their big attack. This is where the British are going to launch another attack just a few days before that. There's all kinds of local fighting going on. But he's here caught between those two places. Now, in theory, you'd think that would make him relatively safe from what was going to happen. But shortly before they went into the line, the French troops that they had relieved had secured a victory. They'd captured a German post, which was in front of their trenches. But the downside of this was that it meant that while the trenches were usually 100 to 200 yards apart, they were 4 yards apart in the sector that Dick found himself. They were literally within touching distance of the Germans. It was a very sensitive spot for the Germans, and they really wanted the British out of there. They wanted to regain this post this post for themselves. And so they were subjecting this area for a period of 2 days to an intense trench mortar bombardment, the 2 days that Dick and his unit were in there. On the first of those days, Dick was wounded in the head by a gunshot or a piece of shrapnel perhaps, and he was evacuated for treatment at a casualty clearing station. After that, it was a blighty wound. It was not serious enough that he couldn't be moved, but it was serious enough that he wasn't going to get better anytime soon. And he was evacuated to England, and he was back in this country at the end of April of 1915. He spent a long time recuperating, months and months probably. He spent most of that in hospital before he was transferred to a reserve battalion, medically assessed by a senior medical officer, and they decided they'd have to discharge him. He would not be fit to serve anymore. He was given a silver war badge, little badge that you wear on your lapel. You'd wear this as it's a badge of honour, really. It's a mark of thanks from your country to show that you've served and you've given something to the cause. But more practically than that, it was to stop you being attacked or to stop you being verbally or physically assaulted in the street for not doing your bit, for shirking, particularly if maybe you've been gassed and your injuries weren't particularly visible. And he had one of those, and no doubt he would have worn it with pride. He returned to chauffeuring. He worked at a couple of upmarket addresses at St James's and Mayfair, and at the second of those addresses, he met a cook living at the same address, serving the same household, and they, in very short order, were married. Unfortunately, that probably meant the end of their employment, and they had to find a new home, and they moved to Mitcham. They went on to have 2 girls together. Now, Dick gave up the chauffeuring. He became a lorry driver, another relatively new occupation, and he continued to work for several years. His second daughter was born in January 1921. Sadly, Dick didn't live to see her take her first steps. He died very shortly after she was born in March of 1921. He is not entitled to a war grave. His death certificate says that he was gassed at Ypres, which we know is not true. It cannot be true. The Germans hadn't used gas at the time he was wounded. His medical records only talk about the gunshot wound to his forehead. But But he died of bronchitis, and the doctor attributed the primary cause of death to having been gassed. He's not commemorated on any war memorials here, but he is commemorated in our war memorial book, which we hold in the chapel. He is seen by the people of Banstead then and today as being a casualty of the First World War, as much as any of the men that we have commemorated. He's buried here just outside the door in the family grave, and we're going to be laying a wreath on his grave very shortly. He was 27 years old, left a widow and two very young children.